Build it and they will come. 15 years ago, Richard Florida, one of the world's leading urbanists, urged city leaders to make urban areas more attractive to the creative class. College-educated millennials, entrepreneurs and artists. In his book called The Rise of the Creative Class, he argued that these people would help revitalize blighted urban areas and help under-resourced communities. Well, the creative class came, and instead of transforming cities to benefit all, they in fact accelerated gentrification, unaffordability and inequality. Richard Florida explains how he got it wrong in his new book. It's called The Urban Crisis: How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation and Failing the Middle Class, and What We Can Do About It. Professor Richard Florida joins us now. Hello.
How are you, Jesse? It's great to be with you.
Yeah, lovely to chat to you. And when you first wrote about the rise of the creative class in 2002, I think it was, what were you concerned about then? What was the crisis at the time?
Well, the really interesting thing about it is right after the book, I got to come to your country of New Zealand and visit a whole bunch of cities and give a whole bunch of talks about my book. So, boy, thinking back to that, and then I actually got to meet Peter Jackson.
Oh, cool.
Most cool.
Yeah.
But at that time, I think what I was concerned about, and what people in the States and in Europe and in New Zealand resonated with, was cities were failing. They were declining. People were moving to the suburbs. And what I was writing about, I began writing this in the late 1990s and early 2000s, was the movement of this group of people I called the creative class: knowledge workers, people who are involved in science and technology, high-tech companies, people who are managers, CEOs, people who are artists, musicians, designers, work in the media like you, and really looking at data and predicting that they were headed back to cities, that they were going to move from the suburbs where they had gone in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and move back to cities. And I think really what has shocked and surprised me in the interviewing period since I wrote that book and visited New Zealand, how it has been sort of an urban revival on steroids. I don't think I could have predicted, nor did many other people or any other people have predicted, the extent and speed and velocity of this urban revival.
Yes. Did the urban planners take your advice too much to heart, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think that's the case. I mean, some people may think that, but, here I was chronicling trends and this beginnings of a trickle of the urban revival. And it's very kind of people to say that, urban planners and mayors took my advice. But I think my advice, regardless of my advice, this urban revival had its own logic. And the reason people and businesses moved back to the urban center is because they were more productive and innovative places to be. It gives one person a lot of credit to say, from Auckland to Wellington to Sydney to Melbourne to New York to San Francisco to Berlin to Amsterdam to Paris that I sort of did this. So I think the acceleration of this urban revival really came as quite a surprise to me, and really is the thing I tried to grapple with in my latest book.
So the creative classes move back and things start to boom, and so far so good. But when did you get the sense that things weren't working out the way you had predicted they would?
Well, it's so interesting to talk to you today. It hit me when I visited Peter Jackson in Wellington. That's the day it hit me. And I remember Peter saying to me, I could have done this in LA, but I decided to do it in my hometown of Wellington. And I decided to build this studio complex. He took me for a tour. And I went back home and I thought about that. And I actually wrote a paper on it. It was in the Washington Monthly in 2003. And in which I said there were two things going on. One, this creative class thing was becoming more global. And I used Peter as an example. But two, when I looked at what was happening, and this is, nearly 15 years ago, I could see that these creative hubs, and I was mainly looking at the U.S. because that's what I had the information and evidence for, San Francisco, the Silicon Valley, Seattle, Boston, New York, and I could go on and list them. but they were the most economically divided and unequal of any city or metropolitan area in the United States. So well before the Occupy movement and the concern over the 1%, nearly 15 years ago, I began to see that this creative economy and creative class was bringing back cities, but also dividing them. Now, I wrote that essay, I published that essay, but I think it really hit me hard. When it really clobbered me is when I moved to Toronto. And, Toronto, which is a great city, Canada's more like New Zealand than it is like the United States. It has a good social safety net. It has good governance. But, in Toronto, well before Brexit and well before Donald Trump, Toronto elected, this guy, the crack mayor. You may have heard of him, this guy, Rob Ford.
Yeah, even we know about Rob Ford.
Yeah, and it really was the crack mayor. He'd go out getting raging drunk and doing crack. And what struck me is if a progressive and open-minded, tolerant city with a good social safety net like Toronto could have this populist backlash that would elect Rob Ford. He was elected by people in the suburbs and outlying areas who felt that they were being left behind by what he called the urban elite. Now Trump calls them the urban elite. I said this could happen in lots of other places, and that Rob Ford was a signal that more and worse would follow. And I think that was my wake-up call. And then, of course, in rapid succession, there was the Brexit. But, of course, I thought as an American who lives in Toronto, well, America would wake up and they would never elect Donald Trump. Oh, my God, this would never happen after Rob Ford and the Brexit. But, of course, here we are today. So I think those events really were my wake-up call to say, look, this creative economy confers advantages on about a third of relatively advantaged people, the scientists, techies, managers, artists, designers, creatives, and about 2/3 of society are falling behind, and they're angry and they don't want to take it anymore.
Were you too optimistic? Did you think that the so-called creative class moving in would help the neighbours rather than push them out?
Well, back in 2002 in my book, the last chapter I called "The Creative Class Has to Grow Up," and I said, the creative class is moving back to cities, renovating cities, trying to make their own lives better. But they really live, I said this, they live on a different planet. They live on a different planet than the remaining 2/3, the blue-collar manual laborers and the people who work in services. And they better grow up and get this. And they didn't. I mean, that said, I have to give the members of the creative economy some credit. If I look at the places that voted overwhelmingly for Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton and against Donald Trump, those were San Francisco, San Jose, the Silicon Valley, Boston, Seattle, New York. So the creative class and the locations where the creative class is are the most progressive parts of the country in the United States, but they're also the most unequal. So it really dawned on me that the financially and economically, the creative class does occupy a world apart from the other classes. And it is time for the creative class and for progressive political forces to wake up and begin to build a broader coalition that can elevate. I call this in my book, we have to move from winner-take-all urbanism, where places like Auckland and Los Angeles and Sydney and London and Toronto are benefiting, and other places are falling behind, and where advantaged neighborhoods are benefiting and within those places and other places are falling behind. We have to move from a winner-take-all system of urbanism to an urbanism that is more inclusive. I call it an urbanism for all, but really that's sort of the political moment we're in today.
I suspect Auckland has changed a lot since you were here, and it's changed in ways that you will probably be able to predict because it's happening around the world. Before we get to Auckland, though, let's stay in Canada for a moment, where the literary review said that your book was Dr. Frankenstein confronting his own monster. Is that how you feel?
Dylan Reed wrote the review, and it's actually a very good review. Headline writers, we never write our own headlines.
Yeah.
And it certainly got me to look at that. But, I think people give all me and others too much credit. To think that a book written by an academic somehow caused Auckland to gentrify borders on the ridiculous. I wish to God I had that much power. But the reality is, this is the result of the most important economic force of our time, which Jane Jacobs identified 50 years before me, and I chronicled Jane, and Robert Lucas, the Nobel Prize winner, identified, It's really the clustering of people, talented and ambition and driven people, diverse people, and of economic assets and of knowledge in dense cities that drives economic growth. So regardless of my writings or prognostications, this was going to happen anyway. And it's happened in ways that I completely failed, underpredicted. I would have never predicted this. So I completely underpredicted. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's my Frankenstein, but certainly it's gotten to the point where we all need to pay it serious attention. And we all need to begin to address it. I just worry that the backlash, particularly from the populist right, is so visceral and forceful, and the anger so palpable, the divide in our country so deep. It's going to be a hard thing it's going to be a hard thing to. Maybe it's more like my Humpty Dumpty than my Frankenstein. It's once it's fallen apart, it's going to be very hard to put back together again.
I'm talking to Richard Florida, author of the book The New Urban Crisis, How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation and Failing the Middle Class, and what we can do about it. When we talk about the housing crisis in New Zealand, which, by the way, I don't know if you've caught up on this, but New Zealand is probably the worst in the world for incomes compared to house prices, and Auckland is the worst place in New Zealand. And we often talk, politicians often talk about supply and demand. That's what happens when you've got too many people coming in and not enough housing stock. But in fact, you also point to inequality and segregation. So what parts do those two things play?
Yeah, I think Auckland is pretty bad, and Sydney and Melbourne are pretty bad, but also Vancouver and Toronto are just awful. So it's not just New York and London. I mean, I think that's the message of this. It's not just New York and London and San Francisco. It's a more pervasive problem. And when you have this level of housing unaffordability in places like Toronto or Vancouver and Auckland, it's a big problem. So I think they're all of a piece. The housing affordability question, the economic inequality question, and I think economic segregation or geographic inequality. And I think the biggest problem of all is probably the geographic inequality or economic segregation. The fact that, I hate that subtitle. God, it's long. I kept telling my publisher, just call it the New Urban Crisis and be done with it. But when you said the decline of the middle class, I mean, that's what's really shocking to me. In Toronto, a city that's somewhat comparable to Auckland, the middle class was about three quarters of Torontonians lived in middle class neighborhoods a generation ago in the 1970s. Now roughly a third of Torontonians do. And Toronto, and like Auckland, has divided into these small areas of concentrated wealth and concentrated advantage in the urban core, around the city center, around the good universities, around transit stops and subway stops. And then much larger spans of concentrated disadvantage that run from the older disadvantaged neighborhoods in this urban core right out smack through the far-lying suburbs. So I think this divide, where not only are places like Auckland growing increasingly advantaged vis-a-vis the rest of New Zealand, not only are places like Toronto operating on another planet than the rest of Canada, but even within Auckland and Toronto, the fact that certain neighborhoods are completely a different world, a world apart from other neighborhoods. That's what I think is so daunting. The fact that we really live in a metropolitan areas which are fundamentally divided by socioeconomic class. That's what really worries me and is in many ways quite disturbing, because it's not just an economic and sociological phenomenon. In my book, I say the great contradiction of modern capitalism is this political contradiction. The very force that generates our economic wealth carves these divides in our societies, which generates a backlash called populism, which threaten to undo all of the great things of innovation and progress and tolerance and civilization that come from urbanized cities in the first place.
One problem is that people move in, these creative classes we'll call them, and they get their house in the right part of town, and then they become very resistant to changes, zoning changes and regulatory changes that would open up their suburbs to other people. And that's, again, an Auckland problem. We hear that word NIMBY a lot, not in my backyard, although I think for you that word is not quite strong enough.
Yeah, I call them the new urban Luddites, after the Luddites in England, who during the Industrial Revolution got so fed up, were smashing the machinery that while it was displacing them from work, was actually making the factories more production and creating wealth, stand. This NIMBY backlash, I think, is in part a backlash from the left. The backlash on the right is the backlash of Trumpism and Fordism and populism. The backlash on the left is this new urban Luddism, which says, I live in Auckland, I live in Toronto, I live in San Francisco, and in order to maintain my property values or the neighborhood character I enjoy, I don't want any further development. Well, that's not just about developing housing. The reason I call it the new urban Luddism is because that kind of NIMBYism or Luddism, urban Luddism, actually inhibits the clustering and the densification and the urbanism, the clustering of people, innovation, startups, high tech, that generates innovation. So in many ways, it is holding back the very source of the wellspring of innovation and economic progress. So it's not just a backlash on the left. It's this just a backlash on the right. It's this left, the obstinance of the left, that has me worried, should have all of us worried as well.
One problem is that the people who need to work in these cities can't afford to work there. I'm thinking of teachers, primary school teachers who aren't big earners, but the wealthy or the people lucky enough to live in these big cities need people to teach their children, right? What's the solution to that?
Yeah, so this is something I deal with at length in the book, and real estate in cities has become a new class of investment asset. It's not just a place to live; it's a place where wealthy people and wealthy foreign people can stash money. And as housing prices have gone up, the rich get richer, but it's not just the poor who fall by the wayside; it's the traditional middle class, the emergency support workers, the fire people, the police officers, school teachers, the people who work in retail shops, the service providers. This is about 66% of all occupations. They can't afford to live there, and this is a fundamental crisis. If the people whose work a city depends on, have to commute. In the case of Toronto, I'll just use Toronto for example, an hour and a half to 2 hours each way. How do you run a city? So fortunately, people are waking up. High-tech companies are certainly waking up. Developers are waking up because they can't market their developments if no one will work in the retail shops and the stores. So look, we have to develop a new model. In the book, I say we have to move from winner-take-all urbanism to what I call urbanism for all. A model of inclusive prosperity where everyone benefits. And to do that, we have to do two or three things. We have to not only build more housing, of course we do in places like Auckland, we have to build more housing, but we have to commit, that's not enough. Just liberalizing zoning codes to build more housing is going to create more luxury housing. We have to commit to building more affordable housing. We have to also build better transit and high-speed rail in certain places, certainly in big metropolitan areas, to connect outlying suburbs or make smaller cities place people can live more affordably and commute to the big city. And then finally, we need a massive effort to upgrade and modernize and pay workers better in these low-wage service jobs, that people are not even making a subsistence income, and I talk in the book, we did that before by manufacturing. Everyone says, well, blue-collar work is good work, but it wasn't. My dad always told me the story when I was a boy, that when he started work in the Great Depression to help support his family, it took 9 family members, him, his brother, my grandma, my granddad, and their sisters to make ends meet. They had to all pool their wages. He came back from his service in World War II, and his job had been transformed into a good job. He made enough money to buy a home in the suburbs and put us through school and college. We made manufacturing work good jobs. We had a union movement, and we had a social safety net. We had a New Deal that said manufacturing workers had to be able to buy the stuff they produce. Well, we can do the same thing today for the millions upon millions of people in New Zealand and the United States and Canada and around the world who toil in these low-wage service jobs. That seems to me the agenda of our time.
In terms of your recommendations around housing, zoning, and infrastructure, I agree with you. Plenty of urban planners agree with you, but does politics get in the way?
I think so. I think, and I hope New Zealand is in a better shape than the United States. I'm sure it is. And I know Canada is. Rolling Stone magazine this week said, about the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, he should be our president. He's the president we, an American, deserve. So I hope things are better in New Zealand. But I think what it is this political divide between the people who live in urban areas and who are thriving and who are seeing their incomes and wealth rise because they live there and they own property and they do knowledge work or creative work, and the rest of society who are faltering, who can't afford a home, are getting pushed out of these urban centers, can't make ends meet. And I think it's that divide. In America, we call it the red-blue divide, the divide between the successful urban areas and the declining rural and suburban areas and the areas that are outside the urban centers. So I think this is what I worry about. I call this the fundamental political contradiction of advanced capitalism or late capitalism or knowledge capitalism or urban capitalism. The fact that the very things that generate our economic future and our innovation are also creating these divides that push us further apart and cause the rise of populist figures like Donald Trump. You take this brew of populism, an anti-immigrant position, an anti-science and technology position, cutting investment in research, an anti-urban perspective, cutting investments in cities and attacking in the United States sanctuary cities. Boy, that amounts to me to an anti-innovation and anti-progress agenda. So, yes, I'm very worried that the thing that could undo this is the political reaction, the political recoil to urbanism.
We're very fortunate to have you on the job. Richard Florida, thanks so much for your thoughts on the matter. Congratulations on the new book, and I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. It's great being with you, and it's been too long. I hope to get back to New Zealand, hopefully in the coming years.